Hi, and welcome to S P A Minar. This is our monthly online gathering for live theater prop professionals and anyone interested in stage props. I'm Monique Walker, SPAM member and one of the founding members. I'm production manager at Stone Dog Studios in Freehold, New Jersey. SPAM is an association of professional prop educators and prop managers from not-for-profit producing organizations with an international communication and support network that shares resources, information, solutions, and techniques, as well as safety information, continuing education, and stock. We promote the highest professional standards among prop artisans and craftspeople and promote the field of props to potential prop professionals while working to establish educational standards for the training of prop artisans, spreading the gospel of props. SPAM was formed in 1994 to create a fellowship among properties professionals to address issues of common importance and to create parity with other production areas. We now have over 150 active members, reaching from Hawaii to Ireland and Canada to Florida. As with previous S P A Minars, we're requesting pay what you can donations to help support this programming and our annual grants for yearly early career prop professionals. If you can afford to donate, the link will be in the chat during the session. We truly appreciate any help you can give. Tonight, Eric Hart is going to talk with us about props you can make at home when you have no shop, few tools, and basic materials. He'll show us some tips and techniques to build props cheaply and safely with materials you can buy locally. Eric is a professor of stage properties at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. He has built props for theater, film, television, opera, Broadway, theme parks, and retail display, with his work being seen on the stages of New York Shakespeare in the Park, Santa Fe Opera, the Actors Theater of Louisville. He and the co-host for the podcast Silk Flowers and Paper Mache Hearts has a YouTube channel full of great videos and regularly posts to his blog Prop Agenda. Eric is also the author of the Prop Building Guidebook, the Prop Effects Guidebook, and the newly released Prop Building for Beginners, 20 Props for Stage and Screen. He holds an MFA from the Ohio University School of Theater. I'll be your moderator tonight and host for the evening. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and I'll pose them to Eric during the question and answer following his presentation. Be sure to stay at the end to hear about our upcoming S P A Minars and other ways you can interact and learn from our membership, as well as to see who will win a copy of Eric's book, Prop Building for Beginners, 20 Props for Stage and Screen. To help facilitate this, please take a moment to make sure your name displayed here in Zoom is the name that matches what you use to register. The winner of Eric's book will be chosen randomly from everyone in attendance tonight. And with that, let's get started. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Monique, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, SPAM, for having me tonight. And thank you to everybody who's attending tonight. Hopefully, we can all learn something. Yeah, so my latest book, Prop Building for Beginners. This is 20 props for stage and screen, step-by-step instructions. The idea is that as a beginner, you can use basic tools and you can use easily accessible materials to kind of build these things. I started writing this book a few years ago, and about halfway through is when the pandemic hit. So all of a sudden I'm having to finish the book from my home. I couldn't get to a shop. I couldn't go out to use tools and machines. I was very limited in what I could buy. And so that's kind of where the idea of tonight's S P A Minar comes from. Like, what can you actually build at home? I actually had a lot of fun building props at home. It was an interesting challenge. It was a lot of fun. It was very, in a lot of ways, it was very relaxing. And I find, you know, a lot of you may need to build props from home from time to time. Not all of us have access to a shop. Sometimes we have to rent an apartment or we have company housing somewhere and all we have is maybe a table to work on, definitely not a garage or anything like that. So yeah, you could build props for your theater, or you could build props for your portfolio. It's a great opportunity to practice some new skills, to really get some pieces that are uh, uh, kind of go after that, like the bread and butter of prop making skills, and just practice them perfectly. So I'll just show you a lot of what I've learned and a lot of what I've kind of discovered along the way. Um, so the first thing, building props at home, like where do you actually build them? What are the limitations of your space? I know I am on my dining room table. That's the space I could find. Um, so here I am. Obviously, unlike a shop, I have to clear this off when we're having guests over or something like that. I don't really have a place to like store everything. So the first thing is like storage space is really limited, right? Not only that, but other things like your ceiling height is often limited. The location of power outlets are really limited. You can't have like a bunch of stationary tools around the place. You can't really get some of those like bigger tools, like a table saw that needs 220 volts. I don't have anywhere to plug that in around here. Not only that, but just large materials, like trying to hustle a full sheet of plywood into my house would be quite an undertaking. If you've ever lived in an apartment, like a walk-up apartment in New York, you know you're not carrying a sheet of plywood up the stairs. Uh, Not to mention the noise that your neighbors are going to complain about, of like saws running and things like that. So like noise and space, the ability to put things away when you're done, just storage in general. Um, so I'm on my dining room table, and your first kind of, the thing you have to think about is how are you going to protect your workspace and keep your workspace clean. You don't want to be getting all your furniture dirty. The one of the main things that I use a lot is one of these self-healing cutting mats, because I'm doing a lot of cutting and I don't want to be cutting into my table. So this has been like one of my go-to work surfaces that I use. Other than that, I'm often cutting up sheets of cardboard to put down on my table. A lot of times I'll cut up a garbage bag so that it's a flat piece of plastic, and sort of tape that onto the table. So in case I spill anything wet, it will dry to the plastic. It won't get onto the table itself. And what I also found really helpful is just to keep the projects sorted. I would do them on a piece of cardboard I could carry. So like this project, because a lot of times maybe I'll paint it, and then I want to set it aside to dry. So I don't want to touch the piece, so I'll keep it on like a piece of cardboard, all the pieces of the project, and I'll just kind of like move it away when I'm done with it. Um, I've also been thinking like the little lunch trays that you buy. Those are good because they got a little bit of lip, so the pieces won't fall off of it. So you could kind of have a bunch of in progress projects that you could sort of set aside to shelves and work on them later, just in case somebody's coming over to dinner and you got to clear the space and you got to tuck everything away and pretend that you're not a hoarder of craft materials for one night. So your workspace is important, your lighting. One of the big things that I don't do in the home is anything that creates too many fumes. So there's a lot of materials and props that you need good ventilation to work with, and that's just not possible in the home. The home ventilation isn't built for that. And also, when you're working at a shop, if you're using a bunch of spray paint, the whole shop is filling with spray paint, and then you go home for the night and you're not breathing it. If you're at home and you spray paint, you're sleeping and those fumes are still in the air. You got some molding and casting curing. Those fumes are filling your room while you're there. There's no place for you to escape to. So one of the big things in my book and tonight, I'm avoiding all those materials. So any spray product, really, spray paints I'm not using, spray adhesives I'm not using. I've kind of narrowed it down to just a few materials that I use over and over again. And the great thing about these materials is they're also locally available. It has a good crossover internationally. So it's this similar kind of stuff you could find in the UK, in Canada. I'm trying to avoid a product that's only made by one company and that can only be ordered from one place, that's not sold in stores. Again, this is like, um, can you run out to Walmart at 3 in the morning and buy materials to finish your prop? Can you run down to the grocery store and buy the materials? You know, this is really important for working at home. Um, you know, and speaking of the toxic materials too, just disposing of it. You know, think about your household trash and putting the trash out. You can't put like half a sheet of plywood there. You don't want like empty buckets of epoxy resin, you know, 5-gallon buckets that you're trying to throw away in the household trash. That's commercial materials, that's industrial materials. It shouldn't really be mixing in. You don't really have a sink to dump that stuff down to in your home. So we're keeping it simple. You've probably seen all these materials before that I'm going to be using, and a lot of it's just about practicing to get really good results from it. So yeah, so think about your workspace, other sort of additions. You want access to water for your painting, for cleaning your brushes. This may be a sink that you could walk to, or you may have to fill up water and sort of keep it nearby. To keep your area clean, you want a nice little dustpan and brush. Small handheld vacuum is great too. You know, I'm not doing too much sanding inside, definitely not too much power sanding, but being able to kind of clean up that dust right away is really important. So otherwise, yeah, I did a good amount of projects in the room right here on this very dining room table with my kids running around the house, with other people doing things in the house, and it worked out pretty well. So let's get started just with how we kind of approach any prop, really, right? You want to build a prop. This is props 101. You want to replicate some objects. Let's talk about that. This isn't designing your own object. This is like replicating an object. You know, so your first step is finding a good reference image. In this case, this is a Roman gladius. This is one of a prop I built. Trying to find a very good flat view of the object. If you can find an object where they have multiple views, like side, back, that's really great. Anything at an angle is going to be tricky, but if you could find a flat image, that's good. Then you want to kind of scale it up to how you're going to build it. There's several ways to scale it up. You kind of want to figure out what size you want it to be. This one, I actually sized this because as we'll see, I built the blade out of craft foam, and the sheet of craft foam that I could find is 18 inches long. So the blade is 18 inches long. So that was my determining factor for this. I also looked up, you know, on museums, and that's within the range of what this actually was. So anyway, I scale it up. I have a printer at home, so what I like to do is scale it up in Photoshop, print it out on a couple sheets of paper, and that gives me a nice full-size drawing, full-size photograph. This is good to sort of check. You could kind of put your hand there. You could see, oh yeah, this feels good. This feels like the right size. That's really good. And then you want to kind of, for a project like this, what I'm doing is I'm going to make a pattern out of this. I'm going to pattern all the different pieces. And so I want to sort of trace it out. So I really like these rolls of yellow canary paper. This is a translucent paper, so you can see what's underneath it. It's very cheap, and it comes in rolls, so you can make it as long as you want. If you have a very long prop and you need a full-size rendering of it. In this case, the sword itself is symmetrical. So I folded it in half, and I traced half of it. And then what I can do is, you know, fold it in half and then trace the other half of it. or I could cut it out and I could make pattern pieces like that. So that gives me a nice pattern to work off of. When I'm approaching a prop, I like to break it down into different parts. This is a good project to kind of show that, to sort of think through. So what makes sense to me is this blade. This looks like one part, right? And then, and it's a fairly flat cutout shape. So that should be easy enough. It's got the hilt here, a little thicker piece, but still that can be cut out of a material, flat, build it up. The handle itself, so the handle is round. So I'm probably looking at a tube or something like that, which, you could find cardboard tubes, you could find PVC tubes. I know a lot of materials come in tube shape, so I'll make that and then figure out how to get these little divots for the fingers. And then something like a circular ball at the end. So figure out how to do that. And finally, a little sort of nut at the end holding it all together. So breaking it down, then I look at the materials to see what can I actually make this out of. Thinking about other needs, I wanted it to be lightweight. I want it to be relatively safe. So maybe something that's not super hard if anybody actually hits anybody with it. And it's a metal blade, so it wants to have a pretty shiny surface to it. So I want a material that's gonna be pretty smooth. I don't want to start off with a piece of exterior plywood and try to sand and fill that. That's a big waste of time. So our first material that I use a lot at home is craft foam. I'm going to call it craft foam. You've probably seen it. You may hear people call it EVA foam. That's sometimes technically correct. It's not all made out of EVA. A lot of it is a cross-linked polyethylene foam, XLPE. You could kind of find that when you're ordering it. But there's a lot of variations of this foam, L200 that Jim Henson uses. It's very smooth. It's a flexible foam. It comes in a variety of thicknesses. So here I got the craft foam that I get at any craft store. This is sort of the thinner stuff. It comes in a lot of different colors, which is really great. Save you time on base coating. This is slightly thicker. Again, these sheets are like 18 by 12. That's kind of how big they are. Now with cosplayers, they use this foam a lot, so you could find larger rolls, a greater range of thicknesses. But just so you know, this is one of the most abundant flexible foam materials in the world. So you can find tons of suppliers for it in all sorts of different thicknesses. You don't really have to feel limited to what you could just find at the craft store. This here is a floor mat, and I actually use this in the project too, because this is a nice 1/2 inch thickness. It does have this texture on the back that can present a problem, but the other side is smooth, which is really nice. So yeah, that's what I made a lot of this sort out of, is just this craft foam. Again, it paints fairly well. Again, it cuts really easily. So we'll switch on over to my little desktop camera. Again, we're on the cutting mat. I always have a good straight edge with a ruler for measuring and for a guide for my knives. I really like any sort of ruler that has a cork backing, because that's gonna grip to the material. If it's just solid metal, it might slide around while you're cutting, which you don't want. And my go-to knife is, you've probably heard of it, the X-Acto knife, right? There's tons of different kinds of handles that you could get to them, but they all use basically these interchangeable blades. They're fairly cheap. This is my go-to is the number 11 X-Acto blade. There's curved blades as well, different sizes and shapes, but this is really good for most of the materials that we're working with. And you know, you want to make sure you're always using a sharp blade so you're not tearing the material. And since they're cheap enough, I usually buy them in bulk, like by the 100. You can buy them from Amazon, from eBay. They're not just made by X-Acto. They're made by a number of different companies, and so you could find them everywhere. And they all fit these kind of basic knife holders. But you'll see this material cuts really, really nicely, really, really easily. Just like that, it's cut. We got this super smooth cut finish on it. You can attempt to cut like a bevel on it as well. So you have a nice angled cut, which is what I did with the sword. And of course, different curves and complex shapes as well. So yeah, change your blades regularly so that they're always sharp. But with this, especially with this thin foam, I mean, this is cutting like butter. This is great. This is exactly what you want to do in your home. It's quiet. It's easy and quick. It's not creating any dust, and you basically cut exactly what you need as you need it. So you know, for the sword, then I made this out of 2 pieces of the foam. The hill I decided to make out of that rubber floor mat with another strip of thin foam kind of wrapped around it. This again, I found a little cardboard tube that some other material had come on, and I used that as the handle. I wrapped some string around to make these little raised ridges, and then another piece of the thicker floor mat foam for this. I ended up putting a small length of wood through the whole thing to keep it rigid, because this stuff remains pretty flexible. So the wood kind of keeps it stiff for that. But yeah, it was pretty easy once I had the pattern. So the first glue I want to talk about is actually not completely non-toxic. But for a lot of this kind of work where you're putting multiple sheets of foam together, like 2 sheets of foam that you want to glue together, any sort of white glue is going to give you problems with that. What you really want is a contact cement. What a contact cement is, it's a type of glue that's intended to be put on both surfaces, and you allow it to dry. And then when it's dry and you press it together, it instantly bonds on contact. It creates an instant bond. The 2 dried areas of glue stick to each other. So you can basically laminate your materials together and not really have any kind of air bubbles or areas of thick glue sort of keeping them apart. You get 2 very flat surfaces adhered very flatly together. Unfortunately, a lot of the traditional contact cements are pretty toxic. So Barge is a really a big brand name that's been around for a long time. Very, very toxic. You don't really want to be using it in your home. If you have an outdoor garage, you might be able to use it there, but you don't want those fumes sort of filling up your house. Again, when you're in your home, you can't just wear a respirator to avoid the fumes, because the fumes are filling your living space, and so they're going to be in the air after you're done taking your respirator off and you're walking around, and everybody who lives with you are going to have to breathe it all in. So Barge isn't great. There are nowadays water-based contact cements, and some of them are actually really good. They're still a little hard to find. They're difficult to find. You often have to order them. You have to order them in larger quantities. So not the best for home. But what I used for a lot of projects at my home was just the regular Elmer's rubber cement. So rubber cement, if you haven't used it since you were in elementary school, can be used as a contact cement. Instead of just brushing it on and sticking stuff together while it's wet, you lightly brush each side and you wait for it to dry. And then when it's dry, you can place the 2 pieces together. So this blade is made out of 2 layers of foam glued together, and it's not coming apart. It's pretty great. So there are some fumes with this. It's hexane or heptane, the same solvent used in gasoline. So, you know, on something this scale in a bottle this size, the amount of fumes coming off, while you do want to kind of blow them away with a fan or have a window open or something, it's not going to overload your house with too many fumes. So in moderation, this rubber cement, I used it for a few projects. It's not my favorite thing to do in the home, but it's kind of the only thing that works for it. So that's kind of the craft foam building projects with that. And we'll talk about how to get a nice smooth finish and some paint on this in a second. But I do want to talk about the idea of layering. So with this, we basically have 4 pieces that we cut out, and that sort of went together. But a lot of times a surface is going to have like raised details and different things going on. And so how you break it down a lot of times is basically build it up with layers of different flat materials. So looking at this crown, this is made out of the same foam as well. And if you think about it, it started out flat and it's just rolled into the circle, but you can still think of it as a flat piece. But what happened to add additional interest to this is I layered several pieces together with different shapes to create these kind of raised details. So it's a ring on the inside, and then another ring with all these points going around. And then I cut out these smaller triangles to make these raised details on the points. I cut out these strips, a strip going along the bottom, a strip going along the top, and then these small strips going up and down, connecting those. And just by basically 2 layers of foam, it creates a level of detail that you can't get with just 1 level of foam. That's difficult to do with paint, and that would be time consuming and difficult to try to carve out of just a thick piece of material. So rather than cutting and carving this out of a thick piece of material, we're building it up with several pieces, and we can cut them flat, which makes it really easy to build, right? Another project I did that with is this lantern. So again, this is basically 4 flat faces, and you can see it's got sort of this base level, that's the whole side, but then an additional piece here, an additional piece there to sort of give it a bit of raised detail. On the top is a flat piece that was bent into a circle with a ring on top of that, and then the same thing there. So basically just a couple flat materials, some of them layered and arranged into a square. And that gives you a lantern. These are, the sides are actually dowels, and they do a great job of covering the seam. If you could cover the seams in your props in an interesting way, then that's going to make them look a lot more professional and a lot more nicely put together. And then just a couple beads to sort of finish off as the finials. So this is another material I really like working with. I call it chipboard. It's not, some people call that particle board used for flooring chipboard. It's not that, it's the paper product. Let me explain. So we have paper, right? And then we have card, which is thicker, stiffer paper. We have cardboard, which we're all familiar with, but then we also have paperboard. And paperboard is basically layers of paper kind of glued together to make a thicker, more rigid material. I call it chipboard. Other people sometimes call it gray board, I think, or just a heavy card. This stuff's about 1 millimeter thick. It comes in a variety of thicknesses. And a lot of what I like to use for the projects is the really, really, really cheap stuff that's made out of recycled paper pulp. So it ends up being brown and speckled or gray. It's got a slightly rough texture. And you could find this at the hobby stores. It's also, if you're still not sure what the material is, it's what a lot of boxes are made out of, cereal boxes. If you take it apart, you could see this is actually the same material as this. It's a lot thinner. And you can build projects out of this. It's a great source. The only caveat is that this side with the printing is really glossy, so it's harder for paint to stick to it. But if you keep that on the inside or otherwise plan your projects out, you can use this for a lot of projects. Again, it's a little thinner, so not always. Also, any sort of pad of paper, that back part, that's the same stuff. That's what it is. So I've built many a prop backstage in the middle of tech by taking my legal pad and cutting out what I needed and painting it up and putting it into the show. Paperboard, whatever you want to call it, pasteboard. This material has been used for props since before Shakespeare's time. This is a very, again, a bread and butter kind of material for prop making. And just like the foam, we're cutting it up with our X-Acto blade, marking down what we need, cutting it out, layering it up, even bending it into more complex shapes. You can do simple curves. You can't really do complex curves like a sphere or a hemisphere, but you could definitely do cylinders with it. It integrates with many other materials well too. So like this is actually a paper towel tube on the top, very similar material. Like paper, it glues really, really easy. This is where I want to introduce our white glue, our PVA glue, the go-to glue for almost every paper project that we're using, that I'm doing. It's non-toxic. It washes up with water. It really is, and it's really, really cheap. So this is kind of the only glue you need for a lot of this stuff. I have, if you've ever looked at this glue, I wanted to point out, Elmer's makes an Elmer's school glue and an Elmer's glue wall. They look really similar. The packaging is really similar. They feel really similar. Like, what is the difference with this stuff? As far as I know, the only difference is Elmer's school glue can still be washed up with water after it dries. Elmer's glue wall can be washed up with water while it's wet, but once it dries, you can't wash it up with water. So this is good when you have kids or you're in school, because you're not going to notice this glue spill until it's dried and you're going to want to clean it up. But it's not so great with props, because if your prop gets wet, the glue is going to soften and it might fall apart. Or if you want to do any sort of technique that involves water later on, it's going to re-soften the glue that has already been put on. So be aware of that. They usually sell them side by side. It's usually the same price, but you want the Elmer's glue wall. That's the basic white glue, white PVA glue that we're going to use for all sorts of paper products. If you've done any woodworking, you know wood glue. Wood glue is also a PVA glue. It's often yellowish, but you can find white wood glue. Again, basically the same stuff. A slight difference. Carpenter's glue usually dries very, very rigidly because you want to be able to cut and sand it while you're cutting and sanding the wood. This dries a little bit more flexible, which actually makes it better for any sort of paper prop. So you can use wood glue. You can switch these out, just so you know that they do dry a little differently and it may not be exactly what you want for that project. Anyway, so yeah, this kind of paperboard can be used for all sorts of projects. This, I'm not sure if I have anything else at the moment. And it paints really easily too. It's rough. It sort of absorbs the paint. You just put it like 1 or 2 layers on it, and it covers it really, really well. So that's really great. One of the things when you're using the white glue, you're going to want to clamp, right? If you've ever been to a prop shop, we have tons of clamps there in all sorts of shapes and sizes. You can never have enough clamps. You might not have that kind of clamp collection at your house. And also when you're doing projects at this kind of scale, you don't need the big bar clamps, the big pipe clamps and all that sort of stuff. So I try to find like cheaper kinds of clamps. Some of the ones I really like are just the little alligator clips that you could find at Harbor Freight or any hardware store. If you could find a bunch in bulk, that's really good. I really like these little ones. They're awesome for a lot of clamping together 2 pieces of paperboard. They're often pretty tight, so they can squish, they can leave a mark on stuff. So you might not want that powerful of a clamp. Clothespins, you can buy boxes and boxes of clothespins, bags and bags of clothespins. Often that's enough force that you need, or a little more force, you could get binder clips in all different sizes and shapes, and again, really, really cheap. So you can actually have like 30 clamps on your piece for just a couple bucks rather than, $30 for 1 clamp sort of thing. So clamps are pretty good. So we got that. We got cardstock. So yeah, I mentioned cardboard earlier. That's a pretty readily available material, and it can be useful for things. If you've ever worked in cardboard and you've ever used it as the outermost surface and you've had to paint it, you know that it's really hard to make it look good. It's sort of, cardboard has all those ridges. They really show up when you paint. If you get it wet, it sort of accentuates those ridges. So I'm rarely using cardboard as the outermost surface, but I do like it for kind of the inside structure because again, it's pretty strong. Once you start laminating several pieces together, you get a pretty strong thing. And I do use it for another method that I'm going to show, this sort of paper sculpting method. So you have this piece of cardboard, and let's say you want to create a more organic shape, right? So far we've been creating a sword, a lantern. These are pretty geometric, machine-made kind of things, but we want something a little more organic. So we got to think about sculpting. We could kind of do that with paper. So what I kind of have here is just a femur bone that I was working on. Again, you get your research, right? Draw out your bone. Again, you can cut this with your X-Acto knife pretty easily. For cardboard, you usually want to take 2 or 3 passes at it. You're kind of cutting through the top paper layer first, then you're cutting through the ridges, then you're cutting through the bottom paper layer next. Again, a sharp blade is imperative for this. If you've ever cut it, you know it starts to tear really easily, right? With this, now that we're getting into materials that are a little thicker, I'll bring up the next knife in my arsenal. And it's this Olfa snap blade knife. There are other brands. Olfa is kind of the originator of this style. So that's what I've always used. But what this has is, it has this blade that has these, you can snap off the blade at regular intervals. So as this gets dull, you just snap that piece off, and then you got a sharp blade after that. So that's kind of handy, but what a lot of props people find even more handy is being able to extend the knife all the way and having this long razor sharp surface or for just a little long. So you could kind of cut at a very shallow angle and get a really long cutting surface, so you can make really nice cuts in a material. It's also great if you get into like thicker chunks of foam, upholstery foam or styrofoam, and trying to cut through like the whole thickness. You can do it with this knife. So I'll sometimes use this on cardboard. Other than that, you know, I do use like a regular box knife or utility knife every once in a while. Again, that because it dulls quickly and the blades are a little more expensive, it's not always worth it. So I'll kind of stick with this. But anyway, that's those different knives that I use. And yeah, so you can cut out of your cardboard. For this paper sculpting method, you want to start off with basically a flat kind of profile of what you want to make, right? This is a shape of a bone, if you can believe it. Before I go too far, I want to mention sharp blades. Since you're throwing away a lot of sharp blades, you're going through a lot of sharp blades, you do want like a sharps container or some way to kind of handle all of that. You don't need like you know, the red Sharps brand Sharps container. You could use any sort of container. The idea is that you're putting your blades into here and they're trapped in here. And then when this gets full, you throw it away. And that means that the garbage collectors are not going to pick up your garbage bag and these sharp blades stick out and poke them and slash up their arms or anything like that. It keeps it safe for the garbage collectors, anybody handling the garbage, anybody at the garbage facilities. Do take care of your sharps. In a pinch, what I've also done, if I just need to throw away one blade, I might take some tape and sort of wrap it up so that the sharp edge is not sticking out anywhere, and then throw that away. But when I'm at my home, I have my sharps container, so I could do that. So anyway, you got this flat thing, and now you want to kind of sculpt it into more of a three-dimensional bone shape. You can actually do that with paper and tape. It's a really great method. Just regular masking tape, the cheap kind of masking tape. Masking tape has a paper backing, so if you have to glue anything on top of it or paint on top of it, it will accept that well. I don't do any prop building with duct tape. That stuff's impossible to paint on top of, unless I'm doing like using that as the final surface, right? So masking tape. You can get the blue painter's tape too. I always find it's too strong of a color, and you have to really cover and coat your final thing with paint or whatever later on to kind of kill that color. This is a much more neutral color, so you kind of stick with that. And as far as paper goes for this, I mean, you could use anything, but again, we want to use the cheap stuff, the stuff you could get in bulk, any kind of newsprint or packing paper. This is just a roll of pretty flimsy packing paper. You can also find craft paper, the thicker brown paper. And you can buy rolls of that. I really like the big rolls for drawing full scale versions of the props as well. But other than that, if you save this from all of your packages that you get, I mean, you could build up quite a collection of brown craft paper for free. That just comes with all the different boxes from Amazon that you get. Same thing with this. You could also use newsprint from the newspaper. Does anybody still use newspapers? I use newsprint for the book, and I had to go out and like buy a newspaper just to get newsprint. You used to find it everywhere, and now you have to like buy it on purpose. Anyway, what you're going to do with this is just kind of start crumpling it up lightly and placing it on here, and then taking your tape and kind of wrapping it around, and you're going to start building up your shape like that. I sort of Julia Child this a little bit. So here it is with a couple pieces on it going on both sides. Because you have the cardboard kind of outline of the shape, you could kind of keep it from going past that and you're just building it up on either side. You basically want to keep building up until you have the right shape. And what's good about this method is, let's say you get an area that's looking a little too thick and you want to make it a little thinner. You can take some of your tape and sort of squish it down with the tape. And so now you're making it a little thinner. And then if you have an area that you want to be a little thicker, you just, grab like a little ball of paper, ball it up and sort of add it there and then tape that on. And you essentially go on both sides and you just keep building it up until you've got essentially, this is like a three-dimensional bone shape, right? And this could actually go further too. It's a pretty rough surface. You can definitely take the time to smooth out the surface with tape, basically until the whole thing is completely covered in tape and you have this nice sort of solid-ish shape. Again, this is great for these kind of organic shapes. It's tricky to do anything kind of symmetrical with it. That's why I picked a bone as the example. But in the book, I did a whole roast chicken like this. So I did each piece individually, the chicken wings, the chicken legs, and the chicken body. And I built it up just with the paper, right? So it's paper on the inside. So it's really light, really cheap. Again, you can find the cardboard, you can find the paper. You just got to buy the tape, which is usually pretty cheap. And then all kind of assembled together like that. And it gives you a nice, it gives you the shape you need, but it leaves it pretty organic looking. It has all that nice little variation in it. So again, you can paint directly onto the masking tape, but usually what I'm doing with this is I'm then coating it with paper mache. That's what this is, it's paper mache. So if you've never done paper mache, props at home is kind of where it shines. Paper mache is taking layers of paper, saturating them with glue, and building them up in layers to create a shape. And often it can be the skin over a sculpted piece that you have, or it could be a completely hollow shape, like a bowl like this. This is, if you don't recognize it, this is from the cover of my other book, the Prop Building Guidebook, but it shows how you could build up like this part with paper mache, and then with a really good paint job, make it look like it was carved out of marble or whatever you have. Same thing with this skull that I made. This was actually carved out of styrofoam, but then the whole thing was coated in paper mache. So even though it's styrofoam, it's not going to start breaking apart and crumbling. It gives it this nice continuous skin. It gives it a nice paint surface. And it has been used professionally. There's this thing with paper mache where it's seen as kind of amateurish, and that's because we do it in elementary school a lot. And a lot of times there are fairly amateurish results, but it's been used professionally. I think Peter and the Starcatcher on Broadway had this great big portal, and it was covered in various found objects like plastic spoons from takeout restaurants. All that stuff is notoriously hard to paint, like plastic water bottles, plastic dishware. So they coated the entire thing in paper mache, and that gave them a surface that was paintable, and it adhered. It made this unbroken shell around it, so it's not going to peel off. So it is used professionally. Paper mache really, from like the 1840s until the 1940s, every single prop was built out of paper mache, unless it's a piece of wooden furniture or a fabric item. It was built out of paper mache. And I've always thought it was really time consuming and labor intensive, and it is. But what I found is when you're doing kind of a few projects at a time, you get into this rhythm. So you're doing your first layer on this piece, then you move to your first layer on this piece, then you move to your first layer on this piece, and maybe your first layer on a second piece. And by the time you're done that, you can then go back and start your second layer and go through the whole chain. So even though it's labor intensive, if you're doing a number of projects, there's no real wait time. You can kind of sit down for a good 3 to 4 hour chunk of time and just crank out like 2 or 3 fully paper mache projects just while you're sitting there watching TV or something. And really, for a lot of props, 2 or 3 layers is kind of all you need for that. So I really like it. Again, your materials are just paper, and I use PVA glue. You can certainly mess with a whole flour water mixture that you make up yourself. That's definitely, it does have some cost savings. You have to worry about the mice eating your paper mache props after that. So I stick with the glue. It's not really that much more expensive. And I know you just have to squeeze it out of a bottle. You don't have to mix it up. You don't have to use it while it's before it solidifies. It's not, it doesn't start out hot and then get cold and clammy while you're using it. And if you do want to save money, you can water this down a little bit too. So you can water it down to save a little bit of money. You could buy bigger bottles of this for sure. As far as paper goes, anything that is uncoated and unsized, so your office paper is heavily coated. Your office paper is more ceramic and plastic than paper, just so you're aware of that. So going back to the craft paper is really good. Newsprint, of course, any of that packing paper. And if you want thicker stuff, watercolor paper doesn't have any sizing because it needs to absorb the watercolor. But that gets a little more expensive. So what you do is you tear it up into these little squares, right? Because you're doing it sort of a square at a time. As you're paper macheing, you got to be able to get around these curves. And so if the piece is too big, it's going to end up with wrinkles, which you want to avoid. So in tiny squares, I usually do a range of sizes because really tight curves are going to want small pieces, and larger flat areas you can get away with larger pieces. You do want to tear the paper, and you want to tear off the cut edges along the side. You never want to cut it. When you tear it, you get this feathered edge, and that makes it easier to kind of keep the edges from being too thick. You sort of transition from one piece to the other.
Hey, Eric, sorry
Yes.
to jump in. Just to let you know, we've got about 5 minutes, and then we have a few questions.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So to finish up with paper mache, so you could do it around the skin, or a lot of times what you want to do is make this like hollow form. So you want to do it over a form. That's what I did with this chalice. This is basically one piece that was done over a bowl. This was another piece done over a dish, and then this was just another tube. So I started off with this glass dish. And when you're doing this, you don't want it to stick to this. I like glass because that's already difficult for things to stick to, but you don't, you want a mold release, right? If you've ever done molding and casting, you need a mold release. What's a good mold release you could use in your home? Surprisingly, Pam, this is a really good mold release for paper mache. Pam is actually a vegetable lecithin, which is used in various professional mold releases. They just call it by different names, but it's essentially Pam. So you could sort of spray the outside of this dish. Your first coat, you want to start off, we call it a water coat. You don't use any glue. You're just dipping your stuff into water, getting it nice and pliable, and starting to put it around. Hopefully it sticks. Each piece you put on, you want it to overlap slightly so there's no gaps, but you don't want it to overlap a lot. So basically the least amount of overlap that you could get away with on that first coat. And you do that around the whole thing, and you sort of let that dry a little bit. Then you go in with your glue coat. And then when it dries, hopefully you can pop it off of there and then trim it down and attach it to the rest of that. And that's this is actually the exact same bowl I did with that. And you can sort of build it up from there. You can use your thinner papers on the very outside to give it a nice fine coat. One more quick little advice. The chipboard you can actually use with paper mache too. And this kind of blew my mind because it feels like really thick stuff. But if you stoke it for just a little bit, a little amount of time, you kind of break it down to where it's pretty pliable. And you could get a really thick, strong coat with just one layer of material. And that's what I did on the bottom of this. So after I formed this, I then went in with a coat of that chipboard, made it really strong just with one layer. So that's a nice thing. So yeah, we're running out of time. I didn't really talk about paint. It got a little more than I could handle in
That's
one.
always the way, isn't it?
Yeah, quick, just with paint. Again, no spray paint. I stuck with just acrylics for every single thing. I practiced acrylics. Surprisingly, the finish on the sword is just acrylics brushed on. With your paint, it's all about when you want a gloss, smooth coat, it's all about prepping the surface before the paint. So really sanding it down. Like 400 grit sandpaper, and I do what is known as wet sanding, where you dip the sandpaper in water and you sort of sand it, so that kind of keeps all the glue from sticking to the sandpaper and getting a nice smooth surface before one drop of paint even goes on. Then you know when you put the paint on, it's going to end up with a glossy surface. You can't expect a gloss paint to do all of the heavy lifting. It needs to be going on a smooth surface. So that's like the kind of the short version of building props at home. But hopefully that's enough to kind of get you excited about it, get you interested, and give you a few tools. You can probably start like tonight with just what you have in your house already to start building some props. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Eric. I have been jotting down the list from the questions from the chat. Our illustrious Pastor Drone wants to know how much of the house is used for making props.
It's really honestly it is just like this
dining
table. I have a workbench. I mean, we actually don't eat in here too much. We're always in front of the TV. So yeah, I'm often set up for weeks at a time on here.
Right.
So,
yeah. And an addendum to that from Patrick was also, how do you living to the PTA? But we all have that problem, right? Like, how do I do props? They're like, oh, that must be fun.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So a couple of one question I got, she was asking, how do you cover the seams so well? I think that was on the lantern with the dowels. How do you do that so well? It does. They're well covered. I agree.
I mean, yeah. So I built all the four sides, and then I actually taped them together on the inside and sort of rolled it into the square shape. And it's just a butt joint at the end, and it really is this dowel is completely covering it. Yep. Yeah. So if the dowel wasn't there,
you'd see.
I don't know. Yeah, you could see, because they don't actually really meet together that well.
Beautiful covering.
Yeah, seam hiding your seams.
Love it.
Is like 80% of a prop. Yeah.
Someone wants to know, when you're gluing craft foam into circles, what do you do to keep it symmetrical?
Oh,
which right, because if you put, it can squish and
so what I did with this is it's two layers, right? Because I needed, the strips were longer than the foam I had, so I had to do it out of a few pieces. So I cut out one strip, taped together the ends, and kind of, I think I might have had a guide, like I drew a circle to make sure it's circular.
Okay.
And then with the contact cement, did both sides. So I had the second strip ready to go. And then while it's in this shape, I carefully glue that second layer on, sort of laying it on around the edge. If you've ever laminated curves together, once they're laminated together, they hold the shape, right?
Right.
Because
Once
the
it's in
outside
there.
is longer than the inside one, and it's kind of holding that. So
Yeah.
with, yeah, this is just the inner ring, the outer ring, and then these details of 3 layers at most, but it basically holds its shape by itself. So it's during the gluing is when you want to
Okay.
make sure you have the perfect circle,
Right.
and
That
then
you're
it will
going.
hold
You
this.
could put it around a bowl or a pot or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. That has
Yeah, I actually measured this for my head just to make sure it would fit, and then sized everything else off
Eric
of
the
that.
King. Someone asked, and this is not a topic you covered, but and we throw it out to our membership. Do you need special paperwork to make a 3D printed non-firing gun? So we yeah, this came up from a gentleman in New York on Broadway had done one. He had the printer
Yes.
there at the shop or
Right,
at the
yeah.
theater and got busted for it. So I can't
Yeah.
answer that. I don't know if
Right.
our illustrious Jim Guy, I know he's online here somewhere. If he has made any forays into that, I'll give him a minute to check
I
that
do
out.
remember Kevin in Yohei, who wrote Theatrical Firearms Handbook. He kind of
Yes.
went into this, and the thing is basically there are a number of laws that might apply, but nobody's really
It's not
taken
defined.
jurisdiction over that. So
Yeah,
it's something that's
it's true.
whoever does it first is going to be the test case.
I mean, my advice to this would be, and I like to think probably Jim would concur with this, is the best you can do is go to the local police and, and really, and
Let them know
have
what you're
them,
doing.
yeah, tell them what you want, what you think, and then have them, sometimes some won't know, some won't have any idea, but
Right,
I know in
yeah.
Washington, DC, they were pretty on it. Not specifically this, but just guns in general. And New York City, of course, has huge, big fat laws about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm gonna go on. There's some other questions here. Do the edges of the tape read after painting when you're doing the tape over the stuff, over the paper?
Yeah, and that's the big reason why I'm always following up with a paper mache layer, because that gets rid of it evens out all the edges, it hides all the edges, that sort of thing. It's sort of like if you're in a hurry, you could do just the tape, but honestly, doing the paper mache. So if you could imagine this was completely wrapped in tape. It has all the tape lines, but once it's coated in the paper mache, it now takes on the completely new texture of the paper on top. And I even did a really thin tissue paper. I think it was actually the canary paper I was using as tracing paper. And I allowed some of those wrinkles to be in so that it looked like kind of chicken skin.
I just, in my experience in the past, I have done when texture or the item allows cheesecloth over the whole thing. You can't keep it glossy or whatever, but it allows for that kind of disguising if it works for that. So
again,
someone asked, someone asked about, and this is this is something I have not had to deal with, but if you're in New York and you're taking public transportation, how about weatherproofing these paper props for travel?
Yep.
Exposed to the elements. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So if you paint it, and if you paint it with acrylics, I mean that's already that's giving it a light water resistance. So you're not going to want to submerge your props, and you're not gonna want to keep them wet, but you've at least imparted some weather resistance to it. I didn't get into coatings too much, but again, there's plenty of you know, if you don't want to deal with the sprays, there are plenty of like acrylic sealants, which are really good. Um, and I didn't break out the Mod Podge, but Mod Podge is another
I
good
love
glue, and
Mod
a
Podge,
lot of
yeah.
that is a good sealer too. And you could sand it and build up a couple coats to get a nice shiny covering,
stuff.
and that will make it waterproof too. A lot of people say this is just watered down Elmer's glue. I think it's a little different, but the idea is the
I feel like
same.
it has some fiber or something in it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's got a bit of a different smell. But
Yeah.
some of it, yeah, some of it is definitely waterproof. And you add that. The other thing I use, which again is a slightly more toxic, and I don't think uh, California, it's getting hard to find it, but shellac. Shellac is
I
only
love
toxic
shellac.
because of the alcohol, but once it's dried, it's completely non-toxic. And the
Right.
alcohol is the same solvent as if you were drinking uh, uh, any alcohol in your home. So if you could control for that, that's kind of what this is coated with. So a nice shiny kind of surface, and that
Is
adds a
that
lot
orange
more water
shellac? Is it
resistance
amber
to it.
shellac?
This was actually FEV. So
Oh,
some yellow ink, uh, amber shellac. Yeah, amber shellac's one of my favorites, but you can get clear too. Um, and like 2 coats of shellac and some 0000 steel wool gives you just the nicest shiny kind of surface you would ever want.
yeah, on a lot of things.
Um, the thing is, you can't buy denatured alcohol in California anymore. So if you want to thin down shellac, you can't buy the alcohol to thin it down. So I don't know, you know, woodworkers are up in arms about that, but I
I
don't know if they
use
have enough
gallons of
clout
it
to,
in
yeah,
Utah. Yeah.
yeah. Um,
Um, so weatherproofing, yeah, I mean, that a lot of that stuff. Someone while you were starting the paper mache on the little vase, was wondering why don't you use the glue in that first layer?
Yes, that's to help prevent it from sticking to the form that you're putting it over.
I
So the glue kind of it still saturates through. It glues the
Mhm.
2 layers together, but you don't want to glue it to your form if you want
Right,
to
because
remove
we don't
it.
want that
If
glass
you're
on
Yeah,
stage.
if you're paper macheing onto a piece, then yes, start off with glue on the
Got it.
first layer for sure. Yeah.
And someone else wants to know what is the best home sealer for foam after paint? I guess we kind of hit that a little bit, but
Yeah, I did uh like this craft foam project. It's all sealed with the Mod Podge, sanded to get a nice smooth finish, and then painted with the acrylic paints. Um, and in a lot of cases, I just use the acrylic paint as the topmost layer for this kind of at-home stuff.
right.
If it's feeling a lot more use, or if it ends up, a lot of times with these products, they end up feeling tacky, even after they're completely dry, and that becomes a problem if they're like sitting in one place for a long time. They get stuck to it. So then you do again, just like a nice acrylic sealer, or again,
Yeah.
shellac. I
Shellac.
really like it
I
as a
love
sealer.
shellac.
And you know, they say it's not waterproof, but I found it's waterproof enough for props.
Oh,
I've
hell
had a
yeah. I
I've had
have
a
used
table.
chalices
Yeah,
with water in it and all kinds of stuff. Yep.
yeah,
I think it is too.
totally.
I mean, I don't know if it's good for you, but it's definitely. Um, Anyone else? I don't see any more questions in the queue. Somebody says Plasti Dip is my favorite sealant, also
Yes,
especially
yeah,
for foam, but it's also pretty toxic. I like,
yeah,
I have used clear spray Plasti Dip on uh there was some the bottle dance in Fiddler on
yeah,
the Roof and
yeah,
yeah, that kind of stuff. So
yeah. I mean, there
um
are some times where you need a spray product. I
definitely.
avoid it for the home stuff, but I
Oh
do
yeah,
every
yeah.
once in a while, I'll step outside and spray something real quick and try to let it off gas. You're really limited to the weather then if you go outside to spray
Sure,
something, and
sure.
humidity. So it's tricky. I try not to rely on it for home products because I don't know when I can use it.
Well, and if it
But
gets on
yeah,
other things, it's
yeah,
pretty, yeah.
but if you have a
Um,
garage, yeah.
Anything else? I don't see anybody else jumping in. And oh, what's the most challenging, interesting prop that you've made at home?
Oh my goodness.
I
I
know.
gotta
In
dig
my
deep for
career, people always ask
this.
me that. I'm like, "Ugh."
Yeah.
Oh, many.
Um, I don't know like if it's a single prop, but this past Christmas, my wife and I, because there have been no creative work for the whole
Mm.
like year, we approached our local theater and said we will build an animated window display for Christmas, so at least they have something running in their theater that people can look at. So we built an entire animatronic window display right in this very room. It was a lot of 3D printing. We got most of the set pieces CNC'd at her school, but then we took it here. So we're building it here. We found our ceiling was like an inch too like an inch, just an inch too tall enough that it did fit, but it barely. So we're like,
Right,
I'm
right.
wrestling full sheets of sheet goods through the house, and
After you
we can't.
recommended no one do that. Yeah, good.
That's why, because it's so horrible. And then like I have my jigsaw and I run outside to make cuts and things like that. But I did a lot of it with the 3D printer.
Yeah.
I didn't
Someone
get
is
into that,
asking,
but that's a
someone is
great.
asking also, what 3D printer
Um,
would you recommend?
yeah, I have the Creality Ender Pro 3, Ender
Okay,
3 Pro, which is it's one of the under $200 printers, and it's pretty amazing for what it does. It's been
great.
pretty consistent. I got the tempered glass bed as an add-on, which is the one add-on I would highly recommend. Otherwise, you get it, you take it out of the box, you assemble it like any piece of IKEA furniture, just a couple pieces. You don't have to
Yeah.
have a degree to build it, and you could be printing within a few minutes. And it
Huh.
works really well, and it's big enough, and that's kind of what I've been doing over the pandemic, is teaching myself 3D modeling and 3D printing, and
Fantastic.
that
That's
means I
cool.
don't need all these other tools. I don't need a drill press, I don't need a vacuum former, I don't need molding and casting. I'm just 3D printing and paper. It's
Yeah, someone
everything.
else seconds it, Ender 3.
Yes,
So
it's
very
a it's
good.
a been around for a while, and it has a big community of people to help out, and
Great,
it's pretty stable. Yeah.
great. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I guess that's, thank you. Thank you for a fun,
Oh,
it was, oh, what software are you using for 3D design?
I'm using Fusion 360 from
There you
Autodesk.
go. Okay,
You could get it free if you're a teacher or a student.
all right. Yeah, so this is fun. I mean, this is stuff I haven't done for, I don't even know how long, but it's really,
Right.
it was some of my the best reasons, I got into the job because it was pretty fantastic. So thank you, very fun and informative evening. And now, drum roll, please. The winner of Eric's new book is Emily Anderson. So she will be contacted after the meeting, after the S P A Minar, and get all the information. I have a little bit of info to read for everybody, just so you know. It's time to grab your Sharpies and mark your calendars, and you better have a Sharpie close by. I have a double-ended, ultra fine, and fine. On May 16th at the special hour of 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have Emer Murphy. She is the prop master at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, Ireland. So this is super special. People don't even know. She's fabulous. She's coming all the way to us from Ireland to talk with us about props in the Abbey Theatre, the National Theatre of Ireland. She appears by kind permission from the Abbey Theatre to talk about everything. She did her master's degree on props and the history of props at the Abbey Theatre. I mean, we're talking the real deal here, folks. Then on the 20th of June, Tom Fiocchi of Ohio State University, who's married to one of my best girlfriends from college, by the way, will take us through his build of the puppets from She Kills Monsters in fighting, is that Tiamat? Tiamat. I don't know how you say that. Anyway, Tom is fabulous. He's entertaining all by himself. He doesn't need puppets. There are more S P A Minars currently in development, so stay tuned for updates. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Links are all in the chat. SPA Minar is produced by the Society of Property Artists and Managers, and special thanks to the SPAM Education, Publicity, and Finance Committees, because they have been doing all of these. I just volunteered to be a host, talking head. Thanks again for watching. Please keep your suggestions for future SPA Minars coming. We want to know what you want to learn about. In the words of Jim Guy, president of SPAM, now go wash your damn hands, put on your mask, be kind to one another, and prop on. See you next time.